Chapter 11. Tear. Reyes had to sidestep quickly to avoid a blow from the armoured figure to his right. Then, almost immediately, he had to duck as the second of his two foes tried to take his head off with a horizontal slash. Far from joining the melee, the elderman remained in the cell that held the remains of Tear. He was watching the action with a slight smile on his face, and he was shouting abuse at Reyes. "Why did you force me to do that?" Reyes ignored the elderman totally. He was too busy. He lashed out with his left hand, his claws extended to their full length. His target was the plate of armour that protected the belly of the guard that stood to his right. As he struck, he suddenly remembered the pain he had suffered the last time he had tried to smash his fist through an enemy's armour, and pulled his blow at the last moment. There was a loud clang as his hand connected. Though he may not have penetrated the metal, he left a hand-sized dent in the stomach plate of his foe, and 3 small puncture marks where some of his claws had even managed to penetrate the armour. Whatever the enchantment covering the armour was, it clearly hadn't made the armour impenetrable. Had he managed to strike his foe with his full strength, as he had intended, then he felt there was a good chance he would have been able to tear the plate loose and expose the next layer of protection below. I still had a use for him. The elderman was almost shouting. Reyes might have been surprised at this new vocal side of the elderman if he hadn't been so busy trying to stay alive. Reyes backed away from the 2 armoured figures. He skipped down the steps of the tower to the 3rd floor. The steps of the tower were narrow, and those suits of armour were so wide that there was no way they would be able to come after him side by side. Even here, back on the 3rd floor of the tower, Reyes could hear the elderman complaining. Think of it, a slave from a noble family. Reyes knew that he had dropped his sword down here somewhere, if only he could remember exactly where. There was light coming in through the tiny window, but although it was enough for Reyes to see a little by, it didn't really help a lot in illuminating the place. His sword could be anywhere. It was a darkened steel blade hidden somewhere in the darkest shadows of the room. There might have been enough light for a human to find it, but the sun would have to be shining virtually right at it for Reyes to be able to catch sight of it. The first of the 2 armoured enemies was right behind him. They had followed him quickly down to the 3rd level, and the first one jumped down from about 3 steps up and landed comfortably. Even before he had settled, he lashed out at Reyes with his short sword. "I guess that's not to be," the elder man was calling. "I guess now I'll have to settle for a harpy slave." Reyes sidestepped the blow easily. He then reached up and grabbed the weapon hand of the armoured figure. He had it in mind that he could disarm his foe and so take the sword for himself. "Oh, I don't mean you, Tanrag," the elderman called. The armoured figure was a lot stronger than Reyes had bargained for. There was a moment of scuffling as the 2 fought over the weapon. At the same time, the second of the 2 armoured foes made its way quickly down the steps and onto the flat surface of the 3rd floor, so that it too could join the fray. There was a punch. Reyes didn't see it coming. It was hard and heavy, and it struck him right on his nose. It took him totally by surprise and forced him to let go of his opponent's sword arm. There was the smell of blood in his nostrils. Reyes hoped it was nothing worse than a nosebleed. With its sword arm now free, the armoured figure struck out at Reyes. The action was fast, and gave Reyes little time to respond. Reyes threw himself to the ground and tried to roll out of the way. Harpies didn't roll that easily. Their wings and tail tended to get in the way, but he did his best. As he rolled, he found something metallic and slightly cold. Reyes had located his sword. "I don't mean your girlfriend either," the elderman was still yelling. Reyes was finally beginning to realise that the elderman was trying to taunt him. He remembered his father teaching him that elves would often try to distract their foes in this manner. As it was, Reyes was too busy trying to stay alive, and he hadn't really heard a lot of what the elderman had been saying. "Although, I will need to hold on to your girlfriend for a few months," the elderman was shouting. Despite there being only limited light in this small room, the armoured figures seemed to have no trouble in seeing where Reyes had gone. Even his grey skin, that was usually a boon in darkened places, seemed to be doing little good for him here. The nearest of the 2 armoured figures tried to make a killing blow, bringing his sword down hard and fast and aimed right for Reyes' head. Reyes brought his own sword into play and parried the blow, although he could feel the strength that the creature had poured into it. At the same time, he lashed out at the second armoured figure, aiming for his opponent's legs with his feet, hoping to unbalance his foe enough to buy him a few more seconds. "Then we'll have a nice execution," the elderman was saying. The second of the two armoured figures wasn't even fazed by the attack. Instead, it slashed down with its short sword and cut a nasty gash in the shin of Reyes' left leg. It didn't feel like the bone was broken, but Reyes' leg screamed at him in pain. "I'll invite everyone," the older man was saying. Reyes lashed out again, this time at the closer of the two armoured figures. He aimed for the weakened stomach plates of his nearest foe. Since he had already damaged it there, it seemed reasonable to assume that it was vulnerable at that point. The sword found its mark and penetrated the armour easily. Too easily. Once he was through the initial resistance of the armoured plate itself, there was nothing behind to hold back the sword. It was as if there was no one in there. And now Reyes knew what the enchantment on the armour did, and why his sleep spell hadn't worked. These were automatons. Reyes tried to remember what Mangloss had taught him about such things. They were fake life, animated through magic, in much the same way as someone from the Legion of the Dead. But unlike a soldier of the Legion of the Dead, they could continue going for centuries until they ran out of magical power. These animated beings would have a reserve of power somewhere. It could be in the chest, the head, or even stored in one of the feet. Reyes needed to locate that power source and somehow sever the connection to the rest of the armour in order to kill it. Reyes didn't have time to ponder the situation too much though. His sword was jammed in hard and he had to let go of the hilt. Then he had to dodge as the second of the two armoured figures lashed out at him again. "Your daughter will become my slave," the elder man was calling. The two armoured figures moved almost as one, clearly with the intention of finishing Reyes off. Of the two, the one with Reyes' sword hilt sticking out of its gut did seem to be moving a little slower than the other, although that might be nothing more than hope playing with Reyes' mind. Disarmed again, Reyes had to use his hands to block the next attack as the damaged suit of armour lashed out at him. Somehow he was able to redirect the blow, buying him a little time to dive behind the automaton's legs. The undamaged suit of armour turned quicker than Reyes felt anything so heavy had a right to do. It slashed at Reyes with its sword, connecting hard and painfully with the tip of the harpy's tail. Reyes cried out in pain and rolled over onto his wings. There wasn't a lot he could do now. The suit of animated armour stood over him and slowly raised its sword for the killing blow. Reyes reached out blindly and somehow managed to redirect the blow, buying a second or two before the armour tried again. It was hard to concentrate on a spell when in the middle of a skirmish, but Reyes did the best he could. He went for something simple. The armoured figures were made of metal, so he selected the rust spell once again from his mighty repertoire. When he had learned the spell, he wondered why he would ever need to rust something, yet already today his spell had proved useful. Reyes reached up with his hand and grabbed the nearest of his two foes by its ankles. The armoured figure responded instantly. It kicked Reyes away and thrust down with his sword once again. Reyes barely managed to avoid the blow, uncertain whether his spell had had enough time to connect properly, or whether all the power he had tried to put into the spell had been disrupted in his need to dodge. The armoured figure didn't even slow down. It seemed to have suffered no ill effects whatsoever from the spell. Instead, it lurched over Reyes as if it wanted him for itself, and thrust its sword down. "Oh, think what fun she and I will have together," the elder man was still talking. Instead of trying to block the blow, Reyes grabbed the armoured figure's sword with both of his hands. The automaton was strong. Even using both hands, Reyes wasn't certain he could hold back the deadly blade for long. Elsewhere on the floor, the second of the two waited patiently. Without any room to manoeuvre, it stood back and watched for an opening. A familiar voice suddenly filled Reyes with hope. "Hi, Tanny. Need help?" It was Orsa. He was standing on the steps next to the second suit of animated armour, a huge two-handed battle axe in his one good hand. The axe was far too large to be swung properly in this tiny room. Orsa decided to try anyway. He dashed past the unoccupied automaton and swung his mighty blade at the head of the suit of armour standing over Reyes. But he had misjudged it badly. The blade was far too big. It struck the wall and did little more than dislodge a bit of brick dust. "I'll make her my concubine," the elder man was shouting. A still undamaged suit of animated armour lashed out. It kicked Reyes in the chest, forcing him to let go of its sword arm. With its arm now free, the undamaged suit of animated armour suddenly decided to change its target. It began to advance on the Minotaur. It was strange how something that had been powered purely through magic could seem to be so malefic. It was almost as if the armour had a truly evil gleam in its eye. It even began to pass its sword from one hand to the other as it approached Ursa, as if it was anticipating the kill. Ursa left his axe stuck in the wall where it was, and began to back his way down the steps. The undamaged suit of armour followed eagerly. Reyes climbed to his feet slowly. He put all the weight on his right foot. A good heal spell would be nice about now, but Reyes wasn't sure he had time to cast it. Although the undamaged suit of armour was on its way down the steps after Ursa, Reyes still had the other suit to deal with. It was standing there now, in the middle of the third floor, the hilt of Reyes' sword still protruding from its gut. At first, Reyes thought that maybe the thing was dead. Maybe his sword had struck the magic reservoir and had done some vital damage to it. It was just standing there, not looking in his direction, not moving at all. It still glowed with a faint blue light, but barely. It was as if his sword was acting as some sort of magical conductor and was slowly draining all the magic out of it. "Think of it, she and I, every night," the alderman was shouting. The damaged suit of animated armour finally seemed to notice Reyes and began to move slowly towards him, but it moved so slowly that Reyes found it easy to avoid the suit's attack. As he sidestepped, Reyes reached up to grab the short sword from the thing's hand. Once again he expected a struggle and was pleasantly surprised to find that the thing had no strength in its arm at all. Reyes relieved it of its sword easily. He even had time to stand there in front of the suit of armour and build up enough power to cast his rust spell properly. He tapped the suit lightly in the middle of its helmet and stepped back to watch the show. "The things I'll make your daughter do," the alderman yelled. The rust quickly took hold of the suit's helmet. It began to eat the metal greedily, and parts of the helmet began to cave in. The suit of armour didn't move again. It didn't fall over. It just stopped moving. That was it, Reyes thought to himself. The main reservoir is in the head. He may have struck something vital in the belly of the beast with his sword, but the way to kill these things was to remove the head. Short sword in hand, Reyes hobbled towards the steps, pursuing Ursa and the other suit of armour. Time could be of the essence. Ursa's axe was still up here where it was embedded in the wall. That meant Ursa was probably unarmed. Reyes reached the steps and began to hop down them. He hadn't liked climbing these steps when both his legs were willing to cooperate, with one of them refusing to take any part in supporting his body weight. Reyes was certain that it could only be a matter of time until a misstep would have him tumbling down the rest of the steps. He hated to make Ursa wait longer than he had to, but Reyes needed to fix his leg before he could pursue. "Maybe I'll have some friends round occasionally. We'll have a party, with your daughter as the main attraction," the alderman called. Reyes sat down on the steps, only too aware of the pain in his tail as he did so. Then he began to concentrate on healing his leg. At least all it required was a heal spell. It wasn't a broken bone like his wing. "Are you still alive, Tanrag?" the alderman was still shouting. "Are you dead yet?" "I don't hear you fighting any more." With his leg repaired, Reyes risked placing his weight tentatively on it. It felt fine. The spell had worked. He hopped up and down on it a couple of times to make sure, and then he hurried down the steps after the remaining suit of armour. He found it just below the second level of the tower, slashing wildly at Ursa, who was descending the tower backwards, keeping just enough ahead of the armour to avoid a wound. Reyes gathered the energy into his hands again, and while the armour was occupied with trying to kill Ursa, he tapped it gently on the top of the helmet, letting all the power of his rust spell centre at that one spot. At first, nothing much seemed to happen. The suit of armour turned to face this new foe, and Reyes had to jump up to the next step to avoid the blow with the short sword. He then met the creature's next blow with his own. There in the darkness of the stairwell, it was hard to see if the spell had had any effect. Then the helmet slowly melted. Whatever was happening to the creature didn't seem to make a lot of difference. Perhaps it was moving a little slower, but it was hard to tell. Reyes parried the next blow, and then the next, but he was being slowly pushed back up the tower. It wasn't enough. Then Ursa attacked from behind the creature. He kicked it in the back of the shins, unbalancing the whole thing. A moment later, Ursa, despite his mighty frame and the limited room in the stairwell, somehow managed to step round the suit of armour so that he was on the step just above it. Then he pushed the armour, sword and all, down the steps. "Look out below," Ursa called. The armour didn't fall all that far before it came to a rest. Reyes hopped down to the level of the armour and prepared to plunge his recently procured short sword into the thing's stomach, wondering if maybe these things had a backup power source. There was no need. The armour didn't move. It was dead. "Good work," Reyes said, relaxing his vigil and turning to look at Ursa. Only now did he realise he was a little out of breath. It had been a tough fight. Nice spell, Orsa commented. Thank you, Reyes panted a little. Never found much use for it before today. How did you know I needed help? That was my fault. Came a voice from just below them that Reyes recognised instantly. It must have been she whom Orsa had just shouted his warning to. It was Gagara. She had been behind Orsa on the steps just below where the suit of armour had fallen. She must have been standing right next to Reyes when he had stood poised over the armour, and he hadn't seen her. Her grey skin in the dark of the tower had hidden her so well that Reyes hadn't even known she was there until she had spoken. I heard the sound of fighting, and that elderman making all sorts of nasty claims as to what he intended to do to our daughter. I knew I had to do something. So you came to my rescue, Reyes said happily. You would do the same for me, Gagara replied. You did do the same for me. That's true, Reyes acknowledged. But he had been brought up in a human society, whereas Gagara was a harpy born and bred. She had a different set of moral standards. Besides, Gagara commented, swapping to her natural language, you are my male. Reyes grinned and nodded. That made more sense to him. Gagara had been acting as his bodyguard, protecting her position as his lead female. A sudden thought struck him. I'd love to know how she knew you were pregnant. I'm sure I never mentioned it. Gagara shrugged her shoulders. The three of them climbed towards the top of the tower. At the third floor, Orsa retrieved his axe. Reyes marvelled at the fact that Orsa could even think about using a battle axe that had been clearly designed for use with two hands, when the great Minotaur only had one. He then stepped out onto the floor and walked over to the suit of armour that was still here, and checked it. But it was clearly dead. Aren't you coming? Reyes asked. I'll wait for you here, Orsa told him. There's not really enough room for all of us at the top, and I think you and Gagara have a few things to discuss with our beloved Elderman. If you're sure, Reyes said. When Reyes reached the top of the tower with Gagara just behind him, the Elderman was standing over by the cell. The cell door was open now, and he had cut the body of Tyr down from the chains that had held him. What? The Elderman said. He waved his long dagger menacingly. You want me to scream for mercy? I won't, you know. I'll go to my grave happy in the knowledge that I killed your brother. She's mine, Gagara told Reyes sternly. Reyes glanced at Gagara and then at the Elderman. Part of him wanted to tear himself limb from limb. He wanted to make the Elderman suffer, not just for killing his brother, but for doing it merely as a way to get to him. She said some bad things about what she planned to do to our daughter, Gagara insisted. I want her. Reyes nodded. Gagara would almost certainly give him a quick death, or he couldn't promise himself that he wouldn't take great pleasure in making the Elderman suffer first. It would be better to let Gagara do the deed. Reyes handed the short sword he was still carrying to Gagara. She's yours. Gagara looked at the short sword with a bemused expression on her face, and then she let it drop to the floor. I won't need that. Reyes gave Gagara a final concerned look. Then he turned and began to descend the stairs down to the third level, where Orsa stood waiting. From just one level down, he could still hear the shouting. I am not afraid to die, the Elderman screamed in a shaky tone that belied the truth. That's good, Gagara replied, for I am not afraid to kill. Seriously, the Elderman yelled, you think humanity will accept you? You seriously think they'll take you in? They'll kill you as soon as look at you. You're going to be harpies without a home. Even if the humans did accept you now, in 1,000 years' time, they wouldn't even acknowledge your existence. Trust me, I know how. That was it. There was a loud scream and then silence. Gagara had gotten past his defences and killed him quickly, as Reyes had hoped. Silence reigned for an uncomfortable moment, and then Orsa broke the tension. I asked around the castle about those goblin visitors. Oh yes, Reyes replied. Somehow this conversation felt a little stilted to him, purpose-built to fill a silence. Apparently they had come from the place the humans referred to as the Dukedom of Gnespa. That's on the west side of the country. The side that the goblins are attacking while the elves are streaming down the eastern side. Oh yes, Reyes said. It still felt a little awkward. Orsa was filling the silence by telling him things they both already knew. It seems the castle of Gnespa fell virtually without a fight. Not a single soldier had been left to defend it. Oh? This caught Reyes' attention. His brother Tyr must have sent warning to the Duke of Gnespa, and it had been taken seriously. From the sound of it, they hadn't even left behind a token force as they had at Castle Damoth, although that could just be the goblins making some wild claims. I am sorry about your brother, Gagara said as she joined them on the third level, her right hand covered with the alderman's blood. I know what it's like to lose someone close. Reyes looked round at his beloved and then nodded. I should go and check on him. Maybe I can do something to save his life. He's dead, Gagara said. I checked. I should go anyway, Reyes told her. It's not that I don't trust your judgment. I just know I'll never forgive myself if I didn't make certain personally. I understand, Gagara replied. Reyes hurried up the stairs to the top floor of the tower. He took his brother's head in his hands and checked him over for any sign of life. There was none. There was nothing he could do. The alderman's blade had bitten deep into Tyr's chest and made sure of that. I want to bury him, Reyes said. He was aware that the other two had also climbed to the top of the tower with him and were standing behind him watching. We can't, Orsa replied. We could never get him out of the tower unnoticed. I know, Reyes said, climbing back to his feet and walking over to where the other two were waiting. He sighed as he took one final look back towards his brother and then said, Come on, let's go. 10 minutes later, the three of them were emerging from the prison tower and heading for the main gates of the castle. Gagara flew to the part of the battlements that stood just above the gates and kept an eye on the elves in the courtyard. But there weren't any problems. The elves were either too drunk or too stoned to care what a minotaur and two harpies were up to. Where do you plan to go? Orsa asked as they passed across the drawbridge. South, Reyes told him. At first I hope to find some clues to where the humans have gone, the ones that should have been defending this castle, and the ones that should have been in the nearby villages. And if you find them? Orsa asked. I plan to join them in their quest to free their land from the elves, Reyes replied simply. Orsa looked doubtful. You know, Bartonet might have been an elf, but he was right about one thing. The humans will never accept you. They'll probably kill you on sight. The Duke of this land is a man called Greyforth. Let's assume for a moment that, like his brother Tyr, he's not at the royal wedding as we were promised all the dukes would be. Greyforth is notorious for his hatred of harpies, and I hate to think how he'd treat minotaurs. He'll accept me, Reyes replied, once he knows who I am. Oh, Orsa said, and what makes you so special? Greyforth is my brother, Reyes told him. Your brother, Orsa replied skeptically. I was adopted, Reyes clarified. Okay, Orsa sounded doubtful. Assume I believe you for a second, then what will you do if you can't find them? Then we'll continue heading south, Reyes told him. We'll follow the elven army all the way to the capital. Once there, we might be able to do something to protect my sister. Your sister, Orsa commented uncertainly. My sister, Reyes clarified. Don't tell me, Orsa said. Your sister wouldn't happen to be this new princess we've heard so much about, would she? That's her, Reyes said cheerfully. Makes sense if Greyforth is your brother, Orsa admitted. Reyes nodded. Gaggy, Orsa shouted to the air. I think your boyfriend might be losing his mind.